It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. On Thursday, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro presented a series of 8 new economic laws to the National Constituent Assembly, or the ANC. Following those announcements, he also announced that he will renegotiate Venezuela's state debt. The 8 laws he presented to the ANC are intended to rescue the country from its deep economic crisis, which it has been in for the past 3 years. The laws are designed to modify the price and exchange control system and to strengthen the role of local production and distribution committees and move Venezuela towards an oil pricing system that does not include the dollar, among many other things. The announcement, of course, comes on the heel of new economic sanctions from the Trump administration. 2 weeks ago, Trump imposed strong financial sanctions against Venezuela, which will make it practically impossible for Venezuela to restructure its debt or to take on new debt in the U.S. financial system. Joining us now to discuss Venezuela's economic problems is Mark Weisbrot. Mark recently published an article in The Nation magazine, and it is titled, "Trump's Sanctions Make Economic Recovery in Venezuela Nearly Impossible." Mark is the co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research. His most recent book is Failed: What Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. Thanks again for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Sharmini.
Mark, so let's start with President Maduro's economic policy announcements, which took place on Thursday night. From what you can tell so far, do you think they will work towards recovering Venezuela's economy here?
Well, I think probably not. I think there's some good things there. Try to increase the food distribution, which they have increased recently, I think is a good thing. But they do have these fundamental imbalances in the economy that have not been resolved and have worsened pretty much continuously over the last 5 years. So if you go back 5 years, about this time in 2012, the inflation rate was 18% and the exchange rate was $1 went for, on the black market, 13 bolívares fuertes, the domestic currency. So now you have 600% inflation over the last year, and $1 costs about 20,000 bolívares fuertes. So that has been a pretty much continuous process, and that's because of this inflation depreciation spiral, which, I and others have been writing about for the last 5 years, which is basically you have this shortage of dollars, and that drives up the black market price of $1, and that increases inflation. And then the inflation feeds back into the black market exchange rate, because more people want to hold dollars as a store of value. And and that goes back into the price of imports as the black market dollar rises, and you get more inflation. That just keeps going, and that's what's been going on. If you don't break that spiral, then you still have a worsening situation, and you can't recover. The economy can't recover either, because the only way that the government's kept this from exploding into complete hyperinflation, where the currency basically loses all of its value, is by cutting government spending in real terms. And that, of course, prolongs the depression, which has been going on for more than 3.5 years. So
now, in the Nation article, you argue that President Trump's financial sanctions on Venezuela will make the country's economic crisis worse. So in what way do you think that will take place exactly?
Yeah, that's right. And that is the really terrible thing about these sanctions, which are also incidentally illegal under both U.S. and international law. And the problem is that even the kind of reforms that I was just mentioning are much more difficult now because the sanctions, for example, you would expect normally if they did float the exchange rate, uh, it would hit a bottom and then money would come back because everything is cheap and people no longer believe that the currency is going to keep falling against the dollar. That's what happened, for example, in Argentina in 2001 when they floated their fixed overvalued currency and it crashed enormously. And but it stabilized and then it went back up a little actually, and billions of dollars came back into the country because everybody knew that that was, you know, the exchange rate was going to be stable. Now, something like that could happen in Venezuela, but the Trump sanctions make it much more difficult because they're preventing the government from borrowing. So that internationally, and uh, that creates enormous uncertainty and a threat of default, which would make everything much worse. If they defaulted on their debt, then there would be international seizures of their oil and assets overseas. And
which is
price
probably
their,
what the Trump administration ultimately wants. How much debt is Venezuela dealing with here?
well, in terms of payment, they have $4 billion to pay this year, interest and principal. And you know, I think about half of it's principal, but this is example of it when they're already cut off from this new borrowing, but otherwise they could roll over the principal. That's what countries normally do. But the Trump administration has cut them off from anything. So that means they have to pay off debt that comes due, which, you know, governments don't do normally. They roll it over. They just borrow to pay the, you know, to pay off the principal when it comes due. So that puts an enormous squeeze on them. And what the Trump sanctions have done is prevent them from getting out of that situation. So it locks in the situation that they're in now, even if they make the reforms that they would need to make to stabilize both the currency, inflation, that is not necessarily even reducing, but just stabilize inflation, and stabilize the economy. And they could return to economic growth normally with the economic reforms that they need because they've already cut their imports. They've cut imports by 75% since 2012, which is a staggering proportion. So they've done the hard part. That's the hardest part of the adjustment that they had to go through to adjust to the oil prices. But the Trump financial embargo really prevents them from recovering. And I think, of course, that's what it's designed to do. The Trump administration has made no secret of their desire to get rid of this government. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said that. Trump has said similar things, even threatened.
But at the same time, I mean, depending on who's speaking, I understand that Rick Waddle, the White House's Deputy National Security Advisor, said that the administration does not want a regime change, at least that's the official line, only a change in the behavior of the Venezuelan government. How credible do you think this is in light of everything else they're doing to undermine the Venezuelan economy?
And threatened with military action. I mean, how much more drastic can you get? Oh, look, you had 16 years of George W. Bush and Obama, and they both were, I mean, their administrations were almost continuously trying to get rid of the government as well. So this is nothing different in that sense, just the military threat. And of course, this sanctions and financial embargo, which Obama didn't do, but he did implement the sanctions in March of 2015. And those sanctions hurt much more than the media acknowledged, too, because they were a sign of what was coming. And so, and they also, the Obama administration did try to, and successfully prevented financial institutions like JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America from just doing, for example, a gold swap, which would have allowed Venezuela to borrow, you know, more recently against their $7 or $8 billion of gold reserve. So yeah, they've always been trying to get rid of this government. It's just this, they feel they're closer right now because the government is much more vulnerable, as you know. I mean, this is, again, it's a 4-year or 3.5-year depression. So yeah, that's what they're trying to do. I think that the government will have to get some outside financing, some outside help. You know, China has loaned them in the past years about $60 billion. Most of that has been paid back. The rest is being paid off with oil shipments. So that would be one place where they could go. But I think they would probably have to, or it would certainly help them to present a credible economic plan that shows that they are going to stabilize the economy. That would be one possible solution.
Mark, these 8 laws that was announced by Maduro in the ANC, do you think any of these are going to assist the economy out of its crises?
I don't see anything that stabilizes because, again, there's nothing that really addresses the inflation depreciation spiral or even some of the other severe problems with the price controls. I mean, they do set up new mechanisms to try and control prices, but I don't necessarily think those will work better than the old ones. You know, this is not Cuba. It's not the old Soviet Union. It's really they don't have the police power of anybody that has these kinds of controls. You know, even in South Korea in the 1980s, if you were caught with, you know, $20 bill in your pocket, you could go to jail. This is you know, you can trade currency anywhere in Venezuela. There's no penalties. They don't have a planned economy. They don't have any of the administrative capacity that you would need to maintain a system. That's why, you know, that's why I'm recommending that they let the currency flow. It's not that I think that that's always the best thing, although you don't see really any, you know, very few economies in this hemisphere have anything like that kind of system. And no economist in the world that I can think of would recommend the exchange rate system that they have now. Now, that's not to say that the vast majority of economists can't be wrong. You know, they are. But this is really almost anyone across the political spectrum. And you can see it again. They've had it for 5 years. And you can see exactly how it's destroyed the economy. So I think that those are the kind of reforms they're going to need. And they're probably going to need some outside help, too.
All right, Mark, I thank you so much for joining us today. And stay tuned. Mark is on a field trip to Barcelona next week. And we're looking forward to having you from Barcelona, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Sharmini. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.